tool, the Q&A tool in Zoom, and also through social media, through the hashtag Maps Moldova. With that, I would like to start first with the opening remarks by Mr. Ruslan Malai, Director of the Moldova Public Procurement Agency. Ruslan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the presentation of the findings and recommendations of the MAPS report for Moldova. First of all, unfortunately, the Minister, Mr. Dumitru Budiansky, could not make to be present at this presentation due to the declared emergency with the gas supply in the country. Thus, on his behalf, I'd like to apologize for him for not being able to participate in this event. And let me remind you that the last evaluation of the Moldovan public procurement system took place in 2010. It was undertaken by the World Bank, and it was called Moldova Country Procurement Assessment Report. Since 2010 until now, many things have changed, to include the new public procurement law, also the creation of the National Complaint Settlement Agency, and so on. So in order to continue the reform of our national public procurement system, it was necessary for the government to have an external evaluation of the current state of affairs in the public procurement system. Thus, in 2017, the government requested the World Bank to undertake the evaluation based on the OECD methodology for assessing procurement systems, and abbreviation for this is MAPS. And today, the findings and recommendations, as well as the next steps of this evaluation, will be presented. I'd like to take this opportunity and thank everyone who contributed to the assessment, to include the World Bank team, as well as other development partners involved, and also the representatives of the governmental and non-governmental organizations. Thank you very much for your hard work and commitment, and we look forward to continue the reform of our public procurement system and implement the recommendations of the assessment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ruslan. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Inguna Dobraia, Country Manager for Moldova at the World Bank. Inguna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I also warm welcome to all the participants to this afternoon's event and presentation of the assessment. Allow me to start by thanking the Ministry of Finance and the government of Moldova for their leadership during this assessment. I understand that it has been a tedious work, but I also hope that the results of the assessment will benefit the reforms that the government of Moldova is putting in place. And the government of Moldova has a clear ambition to improve its public financial management system, and strengthening public procurement is an important part to achieve this goal. I'm sure you know the data, but with public procurement constituting 5% of the GDP and around 18% of annual public expenditure in Moldova in 2020, an effective procurement system can help the government to achieve better value for money, and also reduce pressures on public budget, which I think we all feel that at this point is a very important task. Good public procurement contributes to quality of public expenditure, improves service delivery, green recovery, and also helps building trust in government. I also would like to know that public procurement is an important source of business for the private sector, which in turn is an important source for jobs for Moldovans. We also saw that public procurement became very important in responding to the recent and ongoing COVID epidemic. And it helped to ensure expedient and targeted procurement of emergency supplies to save lives. This assessment was mainly prepared to identify strengths and weaknesses of the public procurement system. And as Mr. Malai said, there have been a lot of changes since the previous assessment. Therefore, I think having this more recent assessment could build in the achievements, but also identify the issues that are still exist and still need to be addressed. The assessment was carried out by the World Bank as was mentioned, and in close cooperation with national authorities led by the Ministry of Finance, with major support from the Public Procurement Agency. It involved numerous methods, interviews with contracting authorities, development partners, professional bodies, private sector and civil society organizations. This report not only identified key strengths, which, as was mentioned by Mr. Malai, is legislation, which provides a largely satisfactory basic regulatory framework, incorporating the fundamental EU principles, but also a clear institutional setup, with institutions having various roles in supervising public procurement. But it also identified areas that require further strengthening, which is e-procurement system, which needs to fully match the requirements of the law and the regulations, and also skills and capacities of contracting authorities to conduct procurement, as well as quality of data, which will help government to make informed policy decisions. With this, I think I'm very pleased to see a very extensive report that identifies both strengths and weaknesses, but also provides recommendations. And let me just assure that as the World Bank, we stand by the government to make sure that we are ready to help with implementing these recommendations. And we look forward to collaborate further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inguna. Indeed, this has been an effort of many stakeholders led by the World Bank and the government of Moldova. We would want to go deeper into what you were saying, those findings, those strengths and weaknesses. And for this, I would like, for the first presentation today, to invite Ms. Elena Korman, Senior Procurement Specialist at the World Bank, and Mr. Daniel Iverson, Public Procurement Advisor, who led the team who assessed the public procurement system in Moldova, to present those findings and recommendations. So Elena and Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. On my side, I would like to welcome the audience and thank everyone for joining us for this event. Together with Daniel, we'll talk about, I will briefly talk about this project, how it was organized, what worked well, what didn't work very well, and also discuss the key findings and recommendations. As Mr. Malai mentioned, at the request of the Public Procurement Agency back in 2017, the World Bank was asked to support the government in conducting this assessment, which was very timely, given that the last assessment was conducted in 2010, and given that many reforms have been carried out by the country since then. So the project was approved in 2018. It was postponed by 1 year at the request of the government, and the actual work started in 2019. It took the team a lot of time to carry out the assessment due to various challenges and reasons, which I will speak about a bit later. And also there was a lot. There were lots of participants. There were many stakeholders with whom we had to work and consult. So the report was ready in late 2020, and then the final report in early 2021, after we received all the approvals and made all the required revisions. It was indeed a long journey for all of us, but I have to say that it was worth it. We had a very good participation and implication from the government of Moldova, from the Ministry of Finance, from Public Procurement Agency, Mr. Malai personally, which relentlessly worked on together with us throughout this exercise by providing valuable inputs and guidance. The most important, I think, and what worked very well is that we as a team did our best, tried our best to listen and hear all parties. And apart from the analysis that we conducted, we reflected in the reports the concerns of all the stakeholders, of the interviewed parties. We had very good participation from the public sector, control bodies, from supervisory institutions, contracting authorities, private sector, civil society organizations, and our partners, development partners, during which we learned a lot from these people. And we had separate workshops, we had individual meetings, and we are very thankful that all the people were very open and constructive. We received very good feedback, which helped us come up with, in my view, with a very good and useful report. Also, as you might have seen from the report, the quality of data was quite challenging for us. But we also are very thankful to the multiple data holders who are very open and who provided all the required information, all the information that they had, which helped us to analyze it and put together the report, and also a short analytics, a short report on public procurement data. There were many challenges again, and the pandemic also had an impact on both on our morale as a team. There were travel restrictions. We didn't have these face-to-face meetings, which in my view, I think were the most valuable part of this whole assessment and this exercise. But despite all these changes, I think all the teams were at their best, and we all jointly managed to deliver a product which we hope will only benefit the country. On the Web Bank side, we had a small team of procurement managers and procurement specialists in the bank. We had Daniel as our international consultant and very experienced local consultants. During this exercise, we did a lot of desk work. We analyzed many documents, procurement files. We analyzed the available data. We carried out surveys of a survey of economic operators to seek feedback from the private sector. We discussed with the control bodies, with supervisory institutions, and based on their input, we identified those areas which would require an improvement. Now, as per the MAPS methodology, if we could please, Nicholas, go. I think I've covered it, what went well. Next slide, please. Timing, yes, as you could see, it was a very long project, but I think we did very well, and we managed to identify all those issues which the government can focus on in their further reforms of the system. Next slide, please. Yes, the assessment, as per the MAPS methodology and structure, the assessment focused on 4 pillars, which you can see on your screens. These 4 pillars contain a total number of 14 main indicators, which cover the full range of public procurement principles, policies, and practices. And these indicators were subdivided into sub-indicators, each composed of a number of criteria which represent internationally accepted principles and practices of good public procurement. So the assessment reviewed the actual situation. So the situation in public procurement sector at the time of the assessment, compared it with the criteria and described it.
Și am descris pe acestea, identificând lacunele și de asemenea examinând
for them, and based on this, preparing recommendations for further development of the system. Without further ado, I'm kindly asking Daniel to talk more about the findings and recommendations of the MAPS assessment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena. Before going into details about the findings and recommendations, I think it is important to keep a few important things in mind. The first is that indeed we will present what we found during the assessment, and that is reflected in the assessment report. And indeed, a number of measures have been taken in the meantime. I'm sure that Mr. Malai will have a few words about that. But nevertheless, we hope that the findings and recommendations will be found useful for the further development of the public procurement system and form the basis for reform, in particular for formalizing a strategy for the development of public procurement in Moldova. And with those things in mind, we would now go into some detail regarding the different pillars that Yelena mentioned. On the one hand, the key findings from the assessment, and then the corresponding recommendations. In the first pillar, there were a number of them, like in the other cases as well. And you will see some of them on screen. But we think that it could also be useful to go into slightly greater detail on some important aspects of these. And in the case of Pillar 1, the e-procurement system is one where we found some opportunities for improvement. And I think Yelena will have a few words to start with about that. And I will complement with a few other brief comments on that point.
Thank you, Daniel, but you'd still go through the findings, through the main findings and recommendations apart from the e-procurement system. Now, yes, the e-procurement is covered throughout the entire report. At the time when we conducted the assessment, it required major enhancements. What we noted, and as flagged by stakeholders, the way the system was designed and used in practice did not match the provisions and requirements of the public procurement law. The system does not allow the full range of procedures and award criteria to be used. For example, most of the procurement procedures set out in the public procurement law cannot be used in the e-procurement system. On award criteria, the system was limited to price as the one single award criteria, while the public procurement law offers 4 possible award criteria, such as lowest price, lowest cost, which typically includes life cycle costing, best quality price ratio, quality cost ratio. The assessment also found lack of development and integration into the system of tools for automatically generating reports based on some pre-established criteria that would allow the authorities to make real-time statistics, to oversee the procurement processes and outcomes, as well as allow the civil society to monitor public procurement. The system could not generate all the suitable data for monitoring public procurement, which hampered the work of the public procurement agency, whose task is to, one of the tasks is to monitor public procurement performance. We are aware confidentiality is another issue which was covered in the report, and as an example we gave was that bids become automatically public in full. They are published in full once the award procedure is completed. So we are aware that many things have changed. We are aware that some enhancements were made to the system since the time of this assessment. but we still understand that it still requires some revision. It requires improvement, and as mentioned in our report, we hope by improving or creating a well-performing e-procurement system, most or many recommendations and many findings would be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. I would like to add a few words about a particular issue that we noted, and that is the sequence of the steps in the e-procurement system, particularly when running an electronic auction. The normal sequence of events during evaluation of tenders would be to start with checking the eligibility of the tenderer, in particular the absence of any grounds for exclusion. This may partly be done automatically by linking up with other government databases, for example, for checking that tenderers have paid their taxes and so on. Fine. If those possibilities exist, then this can be automatized relatively easily. But there may also be a need to check the qualifications of the tenderers in terms of their access to financing, their resources in terms of machinery, equipment, production facilities, and so on. And any tenderer who does not meet the eligibility requirements or the qualifications necessary should then be taken out from the procedure. And you would then also, for those remaining, check their tenders for conformity with the technical specifications, with the requirements, and so on. And only then, those tenders that have been submitted by duly qualified tenderers would be eligible for participation in an electronic auction. And the system, as we assessed it, unfortunately leaves opportunity for each and anyone to participate, to make bids, and then only at the end there is an opportunity to check whether indeed tenders are in conformity with the requirements and tenderers are eligible. And the problem in practice is that when contracting authorities see a good price, they may become reluctant to kick out that tenderer or that tender for failure to comply with the requirements. And they also face questions later on from auditors asking disturbing questions. Why didn't you take the cheapest bid? And consequently, in many cases, we have seen with this kind of system in other countries as well, the contracting authorities conclude contracts with tenderers who are not duly qualified and competent to do the work, with items that do not fully meet the specifications, and in the end, the users do not get what they need. And there is also another issue linked to this. It is that this approach, for the reasons just mentioned, creates a kind of unfair competition in the supply market. And the effect, as we have seen, is that many otherwise good, knowledgeable, competent companies working properly simply do not participate at all. And consequently, we have these problems. The sequence of steps as now applied in the system would certainly be possible and even appropriate for small value contracts for standard items. And in the case of call-offs under framework agreements, but it may not always be appropriate for the reasons mentioned in public procurement in general. There are also a few other issues that we found in Pillar 1, alignment of the secondary legislation with the primary legislation with the public procurement law. We understand that this has been worked on. There were also a few issues of standard documents and so on, where I understand that further efforts have been made. So we can then continue with a few points about the remaining issues here, the annual cycle meeting the not meeting the requirements for regular work on public procurement. This is under Pillar 2. People often find it difficult to start working until budget is available at the beginning of the year and feel obliged to spend money at the end. So then there is little done in the first months of the year, and then an inappropriate rush at the end, and consequently not always observation of the due possibility or due procedures. There are also a few other issues related to the institutional framework and the management capacity. And one of them is the absence of procurement data, or the lack of completeness of procurement data, which we will see on the next slide, the last item. And this is related to several of the other findings and recommendations. In fact, information is always key. People need to have information in mind, in the sense that officials and managers need to have knowledge, understanding, experience, and skills in carrying out public procurement, without always looking into the text of the regulations. Information is also something that should be available to each and anyone interested in following what happens in public procurement, and both for the assessment and of course for the ability of the government and individual contracting authorities to carry out procurement and to take policy decisions. We found that the lack of data was an important problem. And this is because the existing systems and databases contained only incomplete or inaccurate information. In some cases, they were structured in a way that relevant analyses were difficult to carry out. And information was often collected and archived only in the form of hard copy documents or scans of such documents, without any possibility to analyze the data using the electronic means that normally would be available. Some efforts certainly are being made to update the e-procurement system in order to facilitate such analysis. During the assessment, we also try to mitigate those problems by sampling hard copy files, both of contracts and, for example, state-owned enterprise regulations on public procurement. We reviewed and analyzed proxy data, for example, the disbursements made by the Treasury, and we carried out a supplier survey. But attention to the generation of public procurement data, making them available, using them for analyzing the situation and the needs, and in that way creating an evidence base for policy making and for the management of the contracting authorities. This is one of the key recommendations that we would make. We also looked.
Daniel, I'm sorry if I could add here, Nicholas, on the data. Yes, the previous slide, or again on the data is, yes, we had to struggle a lot. We had, at the request of the Ministry of Finance, we also conducted some spent analysis, and we had to work with the data. It was a very difficult task because there are many data holders in the country. It is kept in different formats. Some of the data cannot, the data cannot be obtained easily from the e-procurement system. So it took us a lot of time to actually organize the data so that we can conduct some meaningful analysis. Also, an important finding is that the data on small value procurement is almost inexistent. It was very difficult to find this information, this data, because all the reports on small value procurement are submitted in PDF format to the Public Procurement Agency, and then these expenditures are not recorded because the e-procurement system is not mandated for use for small value procurement. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Indeed, looking at Pillar 3, Procurement Operations and Market Practices, we also had some problems because of the lack of data. We understand, we have observed that the procurement skills and the capacity of contracting authorities is limited, but we actually were not able to find out in any detail what procedures, what practices were actually in place, and what were the elements missing in this respect. And hence, we identified a need for capacity building and a number of related measures, also concerning the organization of work within the contracting authorities and the distribution of roles and responsibilities. But this would all be about the demand side, so to speak, of the public procurement market, how contracting authorities and other institutions are carrying out operations and how they work. But the public procurement market is also one with the supply side. And if the demand side, if the contracting authorities and the central institutions do not work well, and the supply side also doesn't work well, then indeed you have a problem. So you need to look at both sides, and that is where again we had some problems in identifying what would need to be done on the supply side. It was clear that indeed a number of enterprises did not participate as would be expected. And it was also evident that there were a good deal of distrust in the system, but we were not really able to pinpoint exactly what was not working, what the concerns were, in a way that would allow us to find out and recommend a number of specific measures. So one of the recommendations here was simply to pay greater attention to this, to look at what indeed are the actual barriers that enterprises are facing and do something about those in order to raise trust and increase the level of participation in public procurement. We mentioned also here a few issues already related to the next pillar, that about accountability and integrity and transparency. There again, the lack of data was a little bit of a problem in many cases, both, of course, for the assessment itself, but also for other interested parties like non-governmental organizations and others interested in participating somehow and contributing to the development of public procurement. We also noted under these headings the problem of having very many supervision bodies with activities that were apparently often carried out in isolation without any harmonization of their approaches or the criteria that they would use for assessing any problems that may come to their knowledge and for giving recommendations. So consequently, we saw a need for greater consultation, harmonization of the approaches, and measures to prevent any overlaps or any gaps in the coverage of the public procurement activities by these supervisory institutions. And also, in particular, to make sure that any recommendations or any decisions that they may take on good grounds would actually be given effect to, that recommendations would be followed, that problems would be addressed, and consequently that any misprocurement or any problems would be resolved in an effective manner, and that sanctions would be meted out whenever needed. There again, it has been difficult to find out how much and what has actually been done. Yet another case of the problem of missing data. And nevertheless, the impression is that quite a number of cases of bad practices, of even misprocurement, have not been identified and addressed as they should. At the same time, it is important to recognize that much of this would be prevented by raising the skill levels, raising the level of transparency, and paying greater attention to doing the right thing in the right way from the beginning. Then this by itself would reduce the need for the work of the supervisory authorities. And it would also allow contracting authorities to work better, to see public procurement as a means to deliver value for citizens, and for the enterprises to see public procurement as business opportunities that would be worthwhile pursuing, and in that way to raise the level of participation, to increase competition on the basis of good quality, good conditions, good prices, and in that way to contribute to generate better value for money in public procurement. So those would be the main findings and recommendations of the report. We have tried to highlight a few specific examples, but there are many others. And indeed, the report will set out in greater detail quite a number of them, and also give a little bit more information about the points that we have put on screen here. So
thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Elena. I think this really is very informative for the persons in Moldova who are hearing and who are attending this webinar, but also to other countries which might be facing similar issues with their public procurement systems, and to find a way forward with these recommendations. We have a good number of questions which we will try to address at the end of the session. So first, I would like to give the floor again to Mr. Ruslan Malai, Director of the Moldova Public Procurement Agency, to speak about, based on these findings and recommendations, what would be the way forward for Moldova to improve public procurement, and which are the actions that you are already planning to undertake. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll talk now about the next steps that are coming out as a result of the findings and recommendations of the assessment. Well, first of all, we need to adjust primary legislation, which is the public procurement law from 2015, as well as the secondary legislation. And one of the examples that already has been raised, it's a small value, which is not part of the law, and it should be part of the law because in the end, it's also public money. And also, we also need to develop strategy, or now it would be called Program for the Development of Public Procurement System in Moldova for 2003 and 2026. So, and as part of the strategy, it will have an action plan with concrete time frame for every activity within the program. We also need to harmonize the financial and budget regulations with the procurement to allow for implementation of longer term projects. It was also mentioned in the report that Moldova has a calendar budget, and by the end of the year there is a problem, because if there are monies left on 1st of January, you'd see zero in your account. So this is why many countries switch to 2-year or 3-year annual budget, and this problem somehow is resolved. So in Moldova, it's still an issue, and I think the Minister of Finance should rethink this financial and budget regulations. We also need to simplify standard bidding documents to allow contracting authorities to get the most value for money under each individual procurement. Here I mean that they need to have more flexibility for their main outcomes of the project that they are running. And the public procurement is a great instrument to achieve this value for money. Next slide, please. Okay, we also need to improve our centralized procurement, because for the moment we have only 2 central purchasing bodies, which is the Center for Centralized Public Procurement in Health Sector and State Road Administration. Unfortunately, for the moment, we do not have a CPB for the Central Public Administration, which would include the government and all of the agencies in subordination, which basically spend a lot of money and probably the biggest chunk out of the overall budget of the public procurement. And neither we have centralized procurement at the regional levels. So even the law, the law allows for contracting authorities to undertake joint procurements. It's not happening, unfortunately. So this is why one of the ideas that these CPBs could be created also at the regional level by regional councils, should assume the procurement of most difficult and complex procurement for all of the institutions within the region. And also in Moldova, we're a very small country. However, we have more than 3,000 of contracting authorities. So which is a big problem, because not all of them have capacity to undertake procurement. And as I mentioned, even if the law allows for joint procurements, it's not taking place, unfortunately. But we also have an ongoing public administration reform. And one of the tasks of the reform to decrease the number of authorities. Once it's decreased, also the number of contracting authorities will be decreased. So which is crucial for Moldova because we are too small to have such a huge number of contracting authorities. Next slide, please. And also we should talk about professionalization of public procurement officers. In addition to the huge number of contracting authorities, we do not have public procurement recognized as a profession in Moldova. So for the moment, PPA developed with the support of Commercial Law Development Program, which is under government of the US government. We have developed during the last year the two-level certification system. And shortly, I hope this year, the Minister of Finance will promote it. There will be a government decree that regulates the certification of public procurement officials. And once it is in place, we will make mandatory requirement for contracting authorities to have within the working group at least one certified procurement officer. It might depend, of course, on the specific thresholds, because otherwise it will make mandatory for any threshold we can block the public procurement system. So far, we're not ready to do this. And once the certification is launched, we will also make the requirements more rigid, so to say. Next slide, please. And of course, our e-procurement system is a huge problem for the moment, with many functionalities that are not in line with the law. It was mentioned by my colleagues from the World Bank. So of course, we would like to have a functioning and fully fledged public electronic procurement platform with all functionalities that are in line with the public procurement law. We also would like the new procurement platform to support the open contracting data standard, and also to have a business intelligence tool that would allow for deep and complex analysis of procurement data. So this tool can be used by anyone, can access all the data from public procurement system, and to do any analysis that is needed to analyze the public procurement system in Moldova. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attention, and we're ready to answer questions if there are some.
Thank you, Ruslan, for this wonderful presentation on the next steps. I think it's very important to understand that these assessments should be really useful for the countries and not serve just a diagnosis of what's happening, but also pave the way towards reform. So we have a couple of questions about the assessment itself. So I'm going to ask first to Elena and Daniel. There's a question on public works, but I would also even try to expand that into several sectors. Many times procurement or people, when they think about procurement, they are thinking more about goods and services. But the question goes into, did you take into account, or was there a specific emphasis on understanding other sectors, including health, works, and others?
I can start, probably Daniel, you can add. Yes, we did look at civil works.
Am analizat și lucrările civile, lucrările de construcții. Într-adevăr, unul din ministere a raportat
almost 90% of their contracts for civil works were amended. They keep amending them, they keep extending them. So when you look at them, when we look at these works contracts and the reasons behind all these extensions and increasing contract values, we actually looked at all the stages in the procurement cycle, how you plan it, how skilled are those people who put together the bidding document, what is the potential, or how the bidding document is developed so that it has some balance, or the contract is prepared so it has balanced risk and contractual obligations for both parties. There are many causes leading to changes in these civil works contracts. I think contract management is one of them. We identified that we noted that many contracting authorities are lacking the skills to properly monitor the implementation of the contract. We also noted that the contract itself is is developed so that, and as perceived by the private sector, by the way, was one of the feedback that we received, that the contract itself favors in a way more the contracting authority, or the contractual provisions favor more the contracting authority than the contractor, both through its payment clauses, for example, or how the penalties are applied. So looking at these contracts is not only about the contract management, how to deal with, which is a significant part to ensure the success of the implementation of these contracts, but also looking at all other steps, starting from the planning stage. And also what I wanted to add here is that data on contract management is unfortunately insufficient and is missing in most of the part, because contract management is already the task of the contracting authority. There is no information in the e-procurement system of how the contracts are implemented. There is little information on the progress, on physical progress, on financial progress of each contract. So if you really want to know how a particular contract is progressing, then you have to work or ask the contracting authority to report on that. Daniel?
Yes, indeed. And this last point also means that it is not easy for outside interested parties, the citizens in general, to get a view of what is happening with the execution of a contract, whether indeed the right things have been delivered. And if the contracting authority is not very vigilant itself, and no one else has a possibility to keep an eye on things, then indeed you have a good ground, unfortunately, for cases of fraud and corruption in the form of not delivering the agreed quantity or not delivering items that would be of the right quality. And in the case of works, for example, there is the risk of substandard concrete and so on to be delivered, of the subbase of a road not having the right type of aggregates, and so on and so on and so on. So again, the lack of transparency is a problem that creates a lot of opportunities, unfortunately, for fraud and corruption, and is a disincentive for good companies to do their best and participate. We also looked indeed at the health sector as a particular case where you have a few other kinds of problems, partly related to the need for having equipment and supplies, particularly medical equipment that on the one hand conforms with the needs of the hospitals and clinics, and at the same time also are duly authorized for use. And there are a number of practical problems that will need to be looked at in greater detail. We also would see a greater opportunity to update and improve the centralized purchasing that is being carried out in the health sector, and to make it more effective and efficient. And that, of course, would align with the intentions that Mr. Malaj presented for the next steps.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Elena. We also have a question, and I think it's in two parts. So we were speaking about the procurement system, about all the functionalities that have to be dealt with at capturing the information and at aligning the system with legislation and regulation, but also on the other end of the cycle, on publishing that data. And the question deals with, on one hand, if the focus of the recommendation is more on publishing raw data that can be downloaded and analyzed by third parties, or more a recommendation for some basic analysis to be undertaken by government authorities to provide for statistics or for other types of information. And this is also linked maybe in those next steps, as Ruslan was explaining, with the use of data standards. So I think maybe, Ruslan, if you could maybe start with how you are viewing that, and curious to see if Elena and Daniel could complement that recommendation.
Well, as of the data, would like all of the data to be within the public procurement system, I mean electronic platform. Those data that cannot be disclosed, we have a law which prohibits to disclose the private data like social security number and so on. Other data that can be made open, will be made open for the analysis of the specific procedure, for the overall analysis and so on. So only data that the law does not allow to disclose will not be disclosed. Other data will be available.
Indeed, I'd like to complement that by saying that if indeed raw data is prepared whenever something happens, when a transaction is carried out, then this data should somehow be available for each and anyone who would need it, subject to due possibilities of authorization and means for preventing data to be corrupted. But having raw data available would mean that the contracting authority itself would be better able to manage its business and to monitor the process and control what is happening in all steps of the procurement cycle. And it would also make it easier for supervisory authorities to identify possible problems for the central authorities like the Ministry of Finance, the Procurement Agency, to collect and analyze data as needed for policy-making purposes, to have a good evidence base. It would allow any other interested parties like citizens, non-governmental organizations to look into the general picture as well as the details of any individual case. And it would also give the opportunity, for example, for education and research institutions to extract data and carry out analysis either as a research project or in the framework of the training, education of students. And we see in many other countries that this kind of analytical work also often provides very valuable insights in the functioning of the public procurement system and how it can be improved, not only in specific individual cases, but also in the more general case.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like now to thank our panelists and our audience. We received many good questions, and I think this will allow many of you to get more involved into procurement, both if you're working in Moldova, but also externally. Please do remember that the full assessment of Moldova is published as an approved MAPS report on our website. There we have the link. And for any information about MAPS, feel free to follow us on social media and also on our website. We will have more of these events for other countries as their assessments get published. So I think this is really a very good example of application of MAPS, of the 4 pillars of the methodology, of the comprehensive list of indicators. And we look forward to see you in a new opportunity. Thank you all for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.